Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today. Well, the Motley Patriot is extremely happy to know that we've had an opportunity to speak with one of our local candidates, Cameron Hamilton. And if you've sort of kept your eyes on the ball here, you'll know that this is a seat that Abigail Spanberger is walking away from. And now we have an opportunity to bring in some leadership that a lot of us find is more united with our values and less sort of aligned with just policy dictates. So we're real excited to introduce Cameron Hamilton.
Thank you for having me, brother.
So how did you get involved in a race in 7th District? Where did this come about?
Well, it came about, I would say, from a calling that God put on my heart for a while. And then ultimately the practical decision of getting involved into politics as a candidate myself came from when a good friend of mine, Nick Freitas, asked me if I would do him the honor of being his representative. We live here in Orange. It's a pretty signature area, has a lot of rich history. And when someone like Nick asks you and then is willing to support you, and when you have people in your community praying with you and discussing this, asking you to consider doing something that's beyond yourself, it's kind of difficult to say no.
Yeah, Nick's a hard guy to say no to. I also understand that some of the ratings that Nick has as a person that's involved in politics is that his scores as a legislator have been very strong, very effective.
Absolutely.
And even though maybe he's not the majority at times as a legislator, he still works really hard to try to move the ball downfield. Is that a fair statement?
It absolutely is. He is right now rated as the most conservative delegate in the entire Commonwealth. Again, we're very proud of that because Nick is our state delegate here. Nick represents in the State House what Madison represented at the federal level. And so here in this region, it's very much a conglomeration of rural with suburban neighborhoods, but favoring small town values. More of a libertarian approach on live and let live, get government out, regulation down, let people live in peace. And Nick has really been a champion of that cause for a long time.
Now, some people would say that, well, Republican values, we're just mean, we're puritanical, sort of digging into us is not really kind of being pro-human, so to speak. And my question to you is, does family matter to you? Or do you have a family? I mean, not everybody knows your background. How do you approach these issues of looking out for our kids?
I think personally that these values resonate quite profoundly, and I think the Republican Party has some rich history to be proud of. It's not perfect, of course, but when we talk about family values, we talk about faith, freedom. I have a family. I have 3 children, 10, 12, and 13. I have a beautiful wife that we've been married for 15 years now. And my value of government, what I believe the role and the function of government should be, is very much consistent with my valuing of both humanity as well as with what I want to seek in my own family. For example, we as principled conservatives, we should advocate strongly for the rich blessings that come from conservatism. It's not an allegorical statement, it's quite literal. Reduction of taxation. We value individuals enough to believe that your hard-earned capital should be retained with you because you will be a better executor of your will and of your own capital than perhaps bureaucrats in DC. When it comes to your enumerated rights, we believe that you are the ultimate individual, that the state should uphold your sovereignty, your individuality, your ability to retain all of your control and dominion over your immediate life, because we value you, not because we're cold and calloused and we want to be removed. We see government intrusion as the antithesis to freedom and as the antithesis, to be honest, to morality. Whenever you remove and disenfranchise the individual from the option and the ability to decide for themselves, you're placing a set of value structures in the argument, whether you realize it or not.
Sure, you can't escape.
What you're doing is you're placing the value structures of bureaucrats over that of the individual.
You sound like a Reagan Republican. I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Yeah, well, I very much do not support government bureaucrats making decisions in your best interest.
Weren't you a government bureaucrat of sorts at some point in time in some of your career?
I wouldn't say that I was a bureaucrat. I would say that I was a civic servant.
So you were involved in government, though.
I was.
You have an inside view.
I very much do.
Now, is it a fair statement to say that there's a lot of well-meaning people in government, but a lot of times it's wrong-headed policy at the top for a lot of people that are there, people want a job, they want to put their kids through college. How do you approach these conversations? Because as I understand, what I have seen, you're at a position now where you're going to be pushing back at government a little bit. Maybe this scares some people. Maybe a lot of guys want you to stay in your lane. Are you running into any of that stay in your lane sort of framing from what this is looking like as a race in the long? Does that seem like a fair question?
It does. It absolutely does. And there's two parts to that question. So the first about the role of government, and do civic servants, do public officials that work in a variety of different capacities, either in the military or as a civil servant working within federal agencies or whatnot, do they want to expand government? Do they want to keep their head down and just simply do their jobs? Look, a lot of Americans are patriotic, and they're benign, simple, and peaceable people that want to live in comfort. They want to provide for their families. They want to go to church. They want to attend local sports games. And they don't want to be inculcated with all this intrusion and all the bureaucracy. I will say, however, we've set forth policies and practices administratively within government that perpetuates the expansion of programs in itself. For example, as a civil servant, I spent 8 years working at the State Department as well as at DHS, the Department of Homeland Security headquarters. You'll never get promoted from executing someone else's job, executing someone else's will, executing someone else's plan. So inherently for promotion, what do we rate you on?
Make your boss look good?
Well, make your boss look good, but what we also get promoted on is how much money did you manage? How much did you expand your portfolio? How did you expand your...
Government's a growth industry to that model.
It is.
That's funny because I've had that as a problem as a kid.
There's a direct incentive to it. Not only that, when it comes to budgeting, anyone who's worked as a civil servant will know, well, towards the end of the fiscal year, what do we have? We have appropriations that are set to run out. So we have this massive spending frenzy where government programs essentially indicate, oh, we have $2 million allocated this year. We've only spent $1.5 million. Hurry, quick, we need to spend that last.
As a contractor, I've seen that from the outside.
Correct.
Yeah.
And why did they say that? Because the bureaucratic practices in place indicate, well, if we don't spend it this year, we won't get it next year if we need it. So rather than acting as a proper fiduciary of the taxpayer, we have bureaucrats, and I've served within government, so I know it firsthand. We have bureaucrats who many times will work to spend expiring funds rather than turning them back into the Treasury as a safe depository and acting as a better fiduciary for the American taxpayer. Examples like that are baked into government in an unfortunate way. And I say this, these are some of the characteristics that we have to fix. This is some of the inherent bureaucratic sickness that plagues our nation. Why do I care about that? Because I value you.
Right.
Because I believe you have worth, and because I believe your funds should be treated responsibly and diligently, so you have full faith and confidence of knowing that the actions of government are in fact in your best interest. And if not, or if it's neutral, I would rather see you return those funds as opposed to bureaucrats making that decision for you.
So you sound like someone who is sympathetic to the job of someone in government. And I ask this question too because it's kind of pointy, but there are people that we've got to bring people to the table. So one of the issues about, we have a lot of government employees in 7th District. And so...
And they're very hardworking.
And I've seen it. My brothers work for Boozown. I mean, I didn't say that, not there anymore. But I have a lot of friends that work in government, and I meet all these people in government that are nice people. And they're all kind of scratching their head going, things are kind of bumpy, but, keep your head down, do your job. What do you say to people that might be, say, on the fence, that have gone to the left, have gone to the right, look to you and go, this guy, he has a lot of experience. He certainly has credentials. I don't want to vote for him just because he's military. I see values in this guy and a genuine eagerness to help. What do you say to a voter that's in the middle? What do we say to the purple voter that we're trying to bring into your concept of better governance, not more?
Well, the first and foremost, the only way we have better governance is by electing officials with higher moral character. So that is always, the answer to bad government is not less government. The answer to bad government is to elect individuals who have a higher ethical code that they adhere to, and then facilitating processes and practices that hold them accountable so as to verify that that check which was cashed to put them in office is in fact returning on investment. They are in fact advocating for the rights and responsibilities and for essentially the needs of the average constituent that sent them there.
How do we give them the courage to do that if it's baked in for so many years?
That's a great question, and the answer is we become active. Through many in the Civil Service Corps, I will say, who work both in the federal government as civil servant employees, as well as those that serve in uniform in various capacities in the armed forces, we've been told for years, well, you can't violate the Hatch Act, therefore you shouldn't be a part of the political process. The answer is, no, the Hatch Act is actually very narrowly applied. It doesn't say that you have to be absent from the political process itself.
You just can't run down the halls campaigning.
Correct.
Spending.
You have to be responsible, and you have to ensure that while you're serving the federal government, while you're serving the American taxpayer, you're neutral. and you're apolitical in the execution of your duties.
Well, I'm having a hard time finding
But
that
as
in
a
certain
civic-
institutions nowadays.
Well, that's true. And as a civic servant, what I think we should remember too is that we should be involved in the political process.
Right.
We, as an active duty service member, we should be involved. You should go to rallies. You should hear board of supervisor discussions. You should see your local political candidates. You should understand the merits of what's coming. You should read Supreme Court cases that are coming before. See the arguments, like, for example, about how the state of West Virginia slapped down the EPA for grossly infringing on its sovereignty when it comes to their
States' rights.
Exactly. When it comes to the 10th Amendment. Big constitutional implications. We don't want a society that simply leaves legislation and wisdom to an elect few. We want to be inculcated as a nation of philosophers, if you will. And
that sounds like Madison talking there.
I would say very much so.
Yeah.
I admire Madison tremendously. Again, I live
Just down the road from
just a
his
few
hangout.
miles from where
Yeah, right.
he's laid to rest.
Yeah.
And it's an honor to be running for a seat that Madison ultimately sat in as a legislator himself. So we want that kind of community where individuals are governing and that they're participating. And Madison makes it very clear. We do not hold the stability of this nation to be based upon the Constitution alone. Rather, we hold the stability of this nation based upon the individual governing themselves according to the commandments of God.
I post that a lot. I'm fond of that mindset.
The point is self-governance. The
Right.
only way we have self-governance is when we have participation. So if you're a civic servant, if you're a service member, be involved.
Sure.
Understand the issues. Listen to your candidates. Hear very specifically the things they advocate for and align them with your values. And if you're unsure, well, then go and have discussions. We've inundated people to say now in the workplace, don't discuss religion or politics. Well, what we
Or
should,
at the dinner table for that
or at the
matter.
dinner table.
Right.
And I understand the peaceful nature of not making conflict. That's certainly prevalent and prudent. The meek shall inherit the earth. That's not an atypical phenomenon to consider when it comes to discussions in the common workplace or at the home. But I do think what we should instead be advising people on is not necessarily avoid these topics. Instead, just engage with them civically and peacefully with the sense of understanding one another. Use, in fact, the Socratic method of perhaps before you start an argument, let me summarize exactly what your point and position is, and then let you summarize exactly what my point and position is. So at least when we start, we're starting from two known distances and two known points on a map versus an amalgamous argument of, well, you believe in this allegorically, I believe in this allegorically. No, let's define it down to specifics so that there's no confusion, because to be honest, there may be areas where we have quite a bit of overlap. There may be even areas where actually we're fairly aligned. This is a non-issue. It was a personality conflict or something else.
Well, this is an uphill battle because, outside observer, I've been involved in social media since my kids were young, just to keep an eye on them. So everyone else is like, well, I don't want to get involved. I'm like, well, if you're not involved, you're not heard.
Right.
If you're not there, you're not seeing. I wonder if there is in fact a way for people to get more involved in ways that they are not familiar with.
Mm-hmm. I think so. And I think we have to be aware that the world is dynamic and changing with new technologies every day. Not only that, the public square is categorically different than what it was
Sure.
at the time of our founders. You don't have the open marketplaces where you would hear 200 or 300 people to gather for the news of the day or to hear compelling debates. People don't read the
Or the local pub.
or the local pub, or even the written word quite in the same way as it used to be.
Yeah.
Now we're looking, and again, a lot of the founders were printers.
Sure.
It's ironic because they believe that the words had power. God himself proclaims that words have the power to grant life or to take it. You know, God breathed into Adam to create him into being. This isn't nonsense.
Yeah.
This is principle and philosophy when you really break it down. So I think when we're looking at conversing in today's realm, and you look at social media, you look at the tools of today's era, we do need to be aware of it. Absolutely. Now, to what degree do we intervene? To what degree do we restrict access? Well, that's a social conversation that we'll have to have at various levels. But I do think that the notion that, well, let's leave those decisions to just an elect class of people and just sort of let them figure it out, that doesn't cut it anymore.
So how do you stand on censorship in those environments? Any thoughts on that? Because right now, there's as these facts come to life, we're starting to see that government, a lot of times in its interest in protecting us. You get into Patriot Act and some of the different sort of loose and sort of fast and loose with policies that were there to defend us against Osama bin Laden style attacks. Now all of a sudden they're flipping on this, and we're seeing like with without getting too deep into the woods on this,
So
but how do you see that?
because I value you as an individual, Paul, I would rather see you have the ability to make a discerned decision on your own merits, with free access to an abundance of information. I abhor censorship at virtually any level possible and imaginable. I do not believe that the way and the method in which we counteract compelling arguments that might be false is through suppression of speech. That's never the solution.
Sure.
We should elevate speech to the point so that in the marketplace of ideals, that which is superior will ultimately triumph.
We're supposed to have enough common sense to weed through it.
Absolutely. We need to have a civic and educated class of people in this country. What I will also say is, when it comes to things like the Patriot Act, you're right. We've had people that have carried the torch of conservative and of individual liberty that have written legislation that is abhorrent in violations against American civic responsibilities and rights and privileges. The Patriot Act was one prime example of that, where many common sense conservatives that were very well accepted and were darlings of the media passed legislation that was a gross infringement on people's rights and liberties. Now we're fortunately coming to grips with some of the Rand Pauls and the Ron Pauls of the day that were warning us, don't pass these pieces of legislation. What you're letting in the door is huge amounts of tyranny and government control. I will never support that under any circumstance.
So the laws they pass to protect us usually end up being what they bludgeon us with.
Are weaponized many times against us. And the
I think
founders,
Nick spoke to this too.
the founders understood this, which is why the Constitution and the Articles were drafted first, before you really had this large focus on the actual Bill of Rights. And then, even although the Bill of Rights was used to negotiate the actual articles found within the Constitution. But that being said, the structure and role of government was designed to what? To limit the abuse of a chief executive who had virtually unrestrained authority, unbridled access to Americans' rights, which our founders saw, lived with firsthand, and abhorred.
Right.
Before we declared our independence, you can see countless letters and envoys appealing to the King of England that our rights as British subjects were being infringed upon by an unsanctioned parliament, and that we as British subjects were not being granted the same freedom and responsibilities that other British patriots were. So when the king ultimately said, well, to heck with you, I'm going to lay on more tyranny, the founders declared, well, then we shall appeal to heaven, the ultimate authority of all.
Right.
And we throw off the chain of tyranny. What we find now in a variety of different things is that we are trading our freedoms and liberties for security or for safety in other areas. An example, the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act that was just recently passed.
Right.
A provision which was, now mind you, the House of Representatives passed one back earlier this last year. It was thrown out because ultimately what was given to them was a bad bill from the Senate, which has become radically progressive from what it was ever intended. That bill included insertion and extension of the FISA 702 responsibilities, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which has been proven in court and proven and actually rebuked by FISA judges as having violated Americans' rights nearly 300,000 times. Yeah. So we are facing this decision where fund the military, right? Pay for our national defense. That decision should never come while sacrificing our individual liberties and freedoms. It's a straw man argument, and I say no. Absolutely not. I refuse the premise of that argument entirely. We should fund our government essential programs that are specifically enumerated.
Instead of throwing them all in a big lunch bag.
And not do so at the back or using our civil liberties as leverage points. And that's what, the reason that's done is because we have bureaucrats that don't value you as an individual. Sure. They value propping up bills and passing legislation in an efficient manner, rather than actually advocating for principles which will bless you, bless your family's life, and will have long-term consequences.
So can I unpack that just a little bit?
Of course.
So one of the things, so I spoke to our Senator Bryce Reeves, and one of the things that the Senator had mentioned is that, and it was sort of an interesting come to Jesus moment for me, was that our leaders rely on input from constituents to sort of point these things out, and that the process is sort of set up to where they can't do all the deep dive on all of it. They don't read the bills. They're getting advice from staff. They're getting advice from people that are vested in these outcomes. I mean, as a legislator, you seem to have a genuine interest in, when you're in that seat, being purposeful as a legislator. How does this go from campaign promises to start leveraging this thing in that direction? What's your thinking? Because you seem to have thought about this a lot.
I have, and that's again some of the bureaucratic practices we have right now. These bills have become so large and so burdensome, and frankly so ungermane in topics. I mean, the fact that the FISA court system was thrown within our National Defense Authorization Act is an abhorrent abuse of authority that we should frankly reject as the American people. So
you think it was expedience that had it that
that's
way?
That's exactly what it was, efficiency. When you look at parliamentary forms of government, that's an
efficient to what end?
Oh, it's extremely efficient,
Yeah.
because not only that, but the chief executive of the government is who? A member of the legislature. You've now unified two branches of government. So what we have here in the United States is wholly and completely unique, where our chief executive is separate from the legislative branch. That was done by intention and design. And again, there's even the scriptures of the Bible that have motivated those inferences in Jeremiah, Isaiah, and many others.
Wow.
About co-equal powers and a balancing act within government. So what you'll find now is we have many bureaucrats, we have many staffing officials and key individuals that write bills continuously, expand these bills to the point where they're so ungermane and so broad in scope and scale that you require essentially a team of staffers to read the appropriation itself. That inherently bakes in more bureaucracy, more of a difficulty in properly understanding the bill.
There's no way out of it
by the legislator. What I've pledged, what I will continually pledge, and we'll be releasing this very soon, the 7 pledges for the Virginia 7th.
Ooh.
So 7 pledges that I firmly commit to that will be 100% things that you can guarantee that I will support.
These are the torches you're going to carry.
Correct.
Nice.
One of those pledges is that I will hand read every single piece of legislation I am asked to decide.
Do your staffers know about this?
Well, it might be a lot of long nights.
Yeah, I'm going to say.
It might be a lot of coffee and Dunkin' Donuts and refills.
Let me go back in time, man.
Yeah, of course.
So it's interesting because the things that I've seen and heard from you is that you really are a fan and a study of history. Young Cameron, many years back, the human side of Cameron. Where did you go from a kid playing baseball, or did you have a sport as a kid?
Wrestling.
Wrestling.
I did wrestling, did soccer, also played rugby. And
how'd you find yourself in a history interest? Because apparently this doesn't just happen, you know. Yeah. Oh, by the way, I'm going to run for office. Let me cliff note history. You seem to have a connection. When did you connect yourself to the American dream? And
I was always fascinated with history as a young boy. It was one of the most interesting arguments and topics of discussion as a young child learning. My father also appreciated great history. We had various old encyclopedia books and historical books to reference. And at a young age also, my father taught me to have a naturally skeptic eye, to read the information presented and then to validate it to ensure that it's in fact accurate.
Due diligence.
Indeed. So that kind of focus, I think, was baked into my growing up as a child, and I'm extremely grateful for that upbringing. Over time, though, I just became more and more fascinated studying human conflict, the nature of man in various different scenarios and environments, because what I also found was you would see some of the most amazing benevolence, but at the same time some of the most abhorrent savagery with mankind going through various times. So the point being, the study of history is a better understanding of the study of humanity. There are so many lessons, so many great things that we can learn from those that have struggled with trials in the past that I think are incredibly insightful. The Greek playwrights, for example, their poetry and their form of art back in the day was meant to tell a compelling story of human nature and human character. And I think that there are so many captive stories and experiences of others that have gone before that frankly could be easily applied to today's environment. So I've always seen the value and the wisdom in studying the past, not to necessarily hamstring you into only repeating decisions that were made in the past. Well, this worked, therefore we have to try
looking
this.
For themes?
But looking for consistencies.
Okay.
Because again, I believe very firmly that history can be one of the most profound teachers that you have. And it's important for us to be both skeptical while also being inquisitive enough to research just exactly what occurred, how, and when. Because what's the goal? The goal here is not so I can attain office. The goal here is to advocate for policy and principle that will richly bless the lives of others. Now, my hope is that by attaining office, I can promulgate and promote agendas for that nature.
Leave it better than you found it.
Indeed. And so the only way to do that is to study great works of the past and great conflicts of the past so that we can contend with the arguments of today's era.
Now, Hamilton, that's an interesting name. And Scots-Irish, Senator Webb, you remember his book, Born Fighting? Did you ever get a chance to peruse that? And sort of the history, you talk about the history of Orange County, but also you kind of go back to some of that original
We do.
Scottish.
So the Camerons on my mother's side came during the Civil War, actually. So I had, again, I had two ancestors come and fight for the North. One was a police officer, one was an actual firefighter in Scotland that came here. That was, again, the Cameron clan. My father's side was the Hamiltons. The Hamiltons, actually, we trace our lineage back to the grandfather of Alexander Hamilton, not Alexander Hamilton himself. A name with a lot of ancient origins also comes from the word Hamildon, Bear Hill in Scotland, a specific region of lowland Scotland on the border between Scotland and England.
Oh, they were fighting all the time.
But they always were, indeed. And I will say proudly, they did fight with Robert the Bruce in the Battle of Bannockburn.
My whole family on my mom's side, same thing, right on that boundary.
But one thing that's ironic about the name Hamilton, while I am a Hamilton and I'm proud of my family history and heritage, Alexander Hamilton is the one that people traditionally think of. He's a bit of a dichotomy. Staunch Federalist, again, a very close ally to James Madison.
Right.
Until they parted ways later on after the creation of the federal government and the first chief executive, George Washington, was formally elected. And then he served in his administration as a Secretary of Treasury. That's where the big divide occurred between the more Federalist approach versus the more states' rights affiliates and advocates such as Jefferson and Madison of the day. And what I will say is, I still give Hamilton quite a bit of deference solely because as a Federalist, one thing that he was fairly uniform was the application of the law. Alexander Hamilton is one of the few individuals that believed staunchly in federalism, but then actually argued against it in court as a civic servant and as a legal analyst and won. There was a huge contending debate over, once the Revolutionary War had subsided, they had this new government. Well, there were many Americans who were still Tories.
Yeah.
Still very loyal to the British Crown. And you had states like New York and many others that believed, well, it's our sovereign right to punish them for their political ideology. Therefore, we have the right to seize property, seize land. Hamilton, among many others, actually fought in court very clearly, proud and very happy to oppose the British government, but fought in court very clearly, indicating that the promises and the privileges of our Constitution and of our Bill of Rights should be bestowed upon anyone regardless of political ideology. So that true civic mindset, that fairness and decency was very prevalent with him. So I give him a lot of respect.
Almost bakes into we're Americans first in that.
Exactly. America first. Imagine that.
Yeah, right.
And I would pride myself as being an America first candidate.
Yeah.
But not only that, later on though, you see the divide between him and Madison quite a bit. And it is ironic because as a Hamilton, while I do support federalism, I am much more in the Madison camp. So I do think James Madison would get a little bit of a tickle to know that the descendant of the Hamilton family is now on his side, because I am much more of a Rand Paul or a James Madison style Republican.
I'm sure they're watching for having fun.
Amen.
What is it, popcorn?
Amen.
This is definitely a popcorn election, I think. You've got a big field coming in. But I'm curious, I had heard that there's been a real groundswell of support for you.
There has been.
I think we touched base on that a minute ago. You've got a lot of folks that have been involved in the race past. Are these current and past endorsements from 7th District races? Or could you clarify for that?
So
tell me
first
who's jumped
on the federal level, I've been honored with some amazing endorsements, such as Senator Rand Paul.
Oh, good.
Chairman Mark Green from the House Homeland Committee, again, incredibly powerful and impactful Republican working in Congress from the state of Tennessee. Also, I've been supported by Eli Crane, Bob Good, Nick Freitas here in the House of Delegates, many others, just amazing and exceptional people. But I've also had the honor now of 3 past candidates who were running for this current position for the Republican nomination. All 3 have decided to withdraw their candidacy and support my campaign, believing that that I'm a man who embodies many of their characteristics of what they want to see in government. So for me, it was a tremendous honor to be supported by, again, Mr. Tarpley, Mr. Sachs, as well as Mr. Moore, 3 absolute daring patriots who have, again, I've had the honor of gaining their support now. So we are certainly picking up steam. We're now...
And not just political icons, if you will, but also grassroots. You've got a lot of grassroots support.
Indeed, we are. Our volunteer base is expanding tremendously.
Outstanding.
We've got signs popping up all over the place.
Okay.
We've got people that really are understanding something that's pretty pivotal that I say everywhere I go. This race really isn't about me. It's about them.
Yeah.
It's about their values.
Yeah.
It's about we the people. And so what we see now is this growing and insular, cohort of our voters here, many of which who are not even Republicans, who are coming out realizing, we need a change.
Yeah.
It's time to bring back truly civic mindsets. It's time to elect people to office who have absolutely upstanding character and are focused, but who also have the scars to prove it.
Sure.
And this isn't just like a compelling promise. I promise to do this. I promise to do that. Now people are saying, show me your scars. Where have you been?
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I have the honor of living here in Orange. We've been very active in our local committee. We've been very active with the school boards, with the board of supervisors, as well as with state government as well, with our local state delegates, state senator, you name it. We've been very active throughout each of those processes because
seems like a perfect storm we're in the middle of politically. There's this
I would say so.
grassroots energy that's happening, and
so.
where the Constitution was born.
Well,
Are we in the middle of that battle continuing?
Orange is the crossroads of the Constitution,
Yeah, nice.
and right now we are facing many constitutional crises.
Sure.
So what we see, for example, with the state of Texas versus what the actual federal government is seeking with the Department of Homeland Security through the Attorney General. The Attorney General and the federal government does have, through the Supremacy Clause, the right to access the southern border. But one thing that was not left remediated under Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution is, what do we do when the states are not, when the federal government is absconding its responsibility? No one disputes that the federal government has the responsibility or the authority to do a thing, but with that comes the required action. What about when they don't? And that's, I think, one principled issue that I don't know that the founders of this country anticipated.
They assumed they'd
envisioned
show
the
up
opposite.
to fight the battle.
Correct. And so what we see now is a legitimate argument from a constitutional perspective of what it means to engage in nullification, as well as interposition, where actual opposition of federal intrusion is engaged in by a state, because a state does not believe firmly that the federal government will execute their responsibilities in good faith. So we are at a very unique constitutional crisis. We are seeing the chief executive institute more executive orders on day one of him coming into office than any other chief executive in our country's history.
So exigent circumstances exist through malfeasance?
I would say part of it. I would say part of it's definitely malfeasance, as much as I wish it were otherwise. I also think part of it's because we have a sleeping giant in this country that's finally been awakened. And so what I'm hoping is that giant, which is we the people, who ultimately are the chief executors of power and who are the best depositories of that power and how it's vested, we're becoming awake, and we're realizing more and more that it's time we return government back to the enumerated responsibilities and no further. So what I think,
the cavalry isn't coming because we're the cavalry.
We are the cavalry.
Yeah.
And so what we're doing now with my campaign is we're waking up the cavalry.
Good.
And we're making sure that people realize we're not here to be radical. We're not here to make nonsense. We're not here to fight. What we are here is to ensure that the promises and the blessings made with this nation are being upheld. And if they're not, we absolutely believe it's our responsibility to show and to advocate for policy where it will be brought about clearer.
So the days of sitting back on the couch and not worrying about it are gone.
Those days are gone, my friend.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I
God bless
appreciate
you,
your
brother.
time. Folks, he's got a website.
CameronHamilton.com. I'd be honored for your support. Join my team. Most importantly, it's not about me, it's about you.
Thanks for listening, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Hamilton. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.